The crown of England, in the year 1348, was worth less than a loaf of stale bread. Not because the gold had tarnished, but because there was no one left alive to buy the bread in the first place. The man who wore that crown, King Edward III, had watched his own daughter die of a disease that turned her skin black and made her cough blood onto her pillow. And he knew, in the cold silence of Windsor Castle, that the entire system of oaths, lands, and loyalty he ruled over was rotting from the inside out, faster than any siege tower could breach a wall. You have heard the story before. The Black Death. A plague. Ships docking in Messina, Sicily, in October 1347. 6 sailors with swollen lumps under their arms. Rats. Fleas. 50 million dead. It reads like a tidy historical footnote in a textbook, a statistic you memorize for a test and then forget. But here is what the textbook does not teach you. The plague did not just kill people, it killed a world. An entire way of life built on oaths and chainmail and feudal loyalty collapsed in 3 years, and what rose from the ruins was something that looked like the modern world, but only just barely. Let me show you how it really happened. How a single flea changed the course of Western civilization. And why, if you had been alive in 1348, the chances of you surviving to see 1349 were worse than the odds of a trebuchet hitting a moving target from 300 meters. The official story, the one you think you know, goes like this. The plague arrived in Europe via the Silk Road, carried by Mongol armies and merchant caravans. It spread along trade routes, infecting city after city. In 5 years, it killed between 30 and 50% of Europe's population. People panicked. They blamed the Jews. They blamed witches. They flagellated themselves in the streets. And then it ended, leaving behind a continent permanently scarred. That is the schoolbook version. Clean, neat, wrong. Here is the first crack in that polished narrative. The plague did not just appear out of nowhere in 1347. It had been brewing in the East for decades. But the real engine of its spread was not rats or fleas. It was grain. Specifically, the Black Sea grain trade. The same merchant ships that carried wheat from Kaffa to Constantinople also carried stowaways you could not see. And those stowaways did not just arrive in port cities. They arrived in the granaries, the storehouses, the very food supply of Europe. The medieval chronicler Gabriele de Mussi, writing from Piacenza, recorded that the Genoese ships fleeing the Mongol siege of Kaffa in 1346 carried the death in their bones. He was describing the first documented case of biological warfare. The Mongols had been catapulting plague-ridden corpses over the city walls. The fleeing Genoese took the infection with them, and when those ships docked in Messina, they did not just unload cargo. They unloaded apocalypse. But here is where the standard account gets even shakier. We are told the plague killed indiscriminately. Rich and poor, young and old, priest and peasant. That is technically true, but it hides a deeper, more uncomfortable truth. The plague did not kill everyone equally. It killed the poor first, and it killed them in far greater numbers. A peasant, living in a one-room wattle and daub hut with a dirt floor, sharing the space with chickens, pigs, and the occasional rat, had a mortality rate that approached 80%. A nobleman in a stone castle with high windows, separate kitchens, and servants who handled the dirty work had a mortality rate closer to 20%. The difference was not luck, it was architecture. The thickness of your walls determined whether you lived or died. You see, the plague bacillus, Yersinia pestis, is transmitted by fleas that live on black rats. But the rats themselves need warmth, food, and nesting sites. A stone castle with its dry moat, its elevated granaries, and its separate living quarters was a fortress against the rodent invasion. A peasant hut with its thatched roof and its central fire pit was a perfect rat hotel. The chronicler Henry Knighton, writing from Leicester, noted with grim precision that in small villages and poor hamlets, the dead lay unburied for weeks, for there was no one left to dig the graves. The rich could afford isolation. The poor could not. Now, watch what happens when you apply this lens to the entire continent. The Black Death did not just kill peasants. It killed the entire economic engine of feudalism. When a third of your workforce dies, the price of labor skyrockets. Suddenly, a serf who had been tied to the land for generations could demand wages, could walk away, could refuse to work for a lord who had treated him like property. The chroniclers called this the insolence of the laborer. The peasants called it survival. And the lords, the kings, the entire chivalric class watched their world crumble with no siege tower in sight. But it gets worse. And I mean truly, historically worse. The plague did not just kill the living. It killed the infrastructure of the afterlife. In cities like London, Paris, and Florence, the churchyards filled to overflowing. Bishops issued emergency decrees allowing mass graves. The chronicler Agnolo di Tura from Siena wrote that the people dug huge trenches and threw the dead in by the hundreds, layer upon layer, just barely covered with dirt. The clergy themselves died in droves, because they were the ones administering last rites to the infected. A priest who entered a plague house had a survival rate lower than a soldier in a pitched battle. And when the clergy died, the sacraments stopped. People died without confession, without absolution, without the final rituals they believed were necessary to save their souls. The psychological devastation of that cannot be overstated. For a medieval Christian, dying without the church was like falling off the edge of a flat world into an endless void. Now here is the hidden truth that most history videos will never tell you. The Black Death was not just a biological event. It was a political and social earthquake that rewired the entire European mind. And it happened twice. The first wave from 1347 to 1351 was the worst. But there were subsequent waves in 1361, 1369, and 1390 that were nearly as deadly. Each wave reinforced the lesson that the old order could not protect you. The oaths your lord swore meant nothing when his entire family had perished last winter. The walls of your castle meant nothing when the plague entered through the grain you bought from a stranger. The relics and prayers you clutched meant nothing when the priest who blessed them was already rotting in a mass grave.
Hello, and welcome
This
to our
is the
service.
part where the narrative
Let's look at
confronts
how
you
this
directly. You are sitting here in the modern world with antibiotics and vaccines and sanitation systems that make medieval hygiene look like a crime scene. You have never known what it feels like to watch your entire family die in a week, to hear your neighbor coughing blood through a wall, to walk down a street where half the houses are silent, their doors left open, their inhabitants vanished or dead. But you carry the genetic memory of that terror. Every ancestor you have, going back 700 years, survived the Black Death. That is what makes you alive today. You are the descendant of the ones who were lucky or isolated or just genetically resistant enough to make it through. That resilience is in your blood, but so is the trauma. What the plague did to the European psyche was profound. Before the Black Death, the world was stable. God had a plan. The church was eternal. The feudal order was as fixed as the stars. After the Black Death, nothing was stable. People began to question everything. Why did God let this happen? Why did the church fail to protect us? Why are the laboring classes demanding wages and freedom? The cracks that appeared in the walls of the medieval worldview in the 1350s would widen into the Reformation, the Renaissance, and the Enlightenment. The Black Death did not just kill people, it killed the medieval mind. And that is the moment the medieval mind shattered. You are still carrying the pieces of that shatter in your DNA, the resilience, the questioning, the hunger for a world that makes sense. If you want to keep watching the real story, the one the textbooks leave out, subscribe and stay with this channel. And in the comments tell me, what do you think was the single biggest idea the medieval world believed that the plague proved wrong? I want to hear your take. Let me give you a concrete example of how this played out in real time. In the year 1349, the city of Florence passed a law fixing maximum wages for laborers. The idea was to stop peasants from demanding higher pay after so many had died. The law was ignored. Within a year, laborers in Florence were earning 3 times what they had earned before the plague. Landlords could not find tenants. Fields lay fallow. The entire agricultural economy, which had been the bedrock of feudal power for 500 years, simply collapsed. And when the economy collapsed, so did the social hierarchy. A peasant with a strong back and a working farm could suddenly marry into a merchant family. A craftsman could buy land that had belonged to a knight. The old heraldry meant nothing when the fields were empty and the barns were full of rotting grain with no one to harvest it. But here is where it gets worse. And this is the detail that will stay with you long after this video ends. The plague did not just kill the body, it killed trust. Medieval society was built on oaths. A vassal swore loyalty to his lord in exchange for land and protection. A serf swore to work the fields in exchange for the lord's protection from bandits and invaders. When the plague struck, those oaths became meaningless. A lord who could not protect his vassals from disease was a lord who deserved no loyalty. A serf who watched his family die while the lord sat safe in his castle was a serf who felt no obligation to pay rent. The entire system, the chainmail of social obligation that held medieval Europe together, snapped. You can see this rupture in the legal records of the time. Court cases from the 1350s are filled with disputes over abandoned land, broken contracts, and serfs who simply walked away. The chronicler Jean Froissart, writing about the aftermath of the plague in France, noted with horror that the common people became so proud and disobedient that they refused to serve their masters. He was watching the feudal world die. He did not recognize it as death. He saw it as rebellion. But it was rebellion born of necessity. If your lord cannot protect you from a disease that kills half your village, your oath to him becomes a form of suicide. Now, let me show you the transformation path. What emerged from the ruins of the plague was not a new system. It was a series of patchwork solutions that, over 2 centuries, became the modern world. The labor shortages led to technological innovation. The watermill, the windmill, and the heavy plow all saw rapid adoption because there were not enough human hands to do the work. The shortage of clergy led to lay piety movements and eventually to the printing press and the translation of the Bible into vernacular languages. The collapse of feudal obligations led to the rise of centralized monarchies and eventually to the nation-state. Every feature of the modern world that you take for granted, your rights, your wages, your freedom to move and choose, has its roots in the mass graves of the 1350s. But here is the uncomfortable question that the textbooks avoid. Was the Black Death a tragedy, or was it a liberation? If you were a serf in 1346, you were property. You could not leave your village. You could not marry without your lord's permission. You could not own land. Your children belonged to the Lord before they belonged to you. By 1356, if you had survived, you could demand wages. You could walk to a new town. You could rent land from a desperate landlord. You could build a life that your parents could not have imagined. The cost of that freedom was the death of half the people you knew. Is that a bargain worth making? You do not have to answer that question out loud, but the people who lived through the plague answered it with their feet. They walked away from the old world, and they never walked back. This is the part where I invite you to stay with me. If you have ever sat in a history class wondering why they only teach you about kings and battles and never about the mud, the blood, and the sheer biological chaos that actually drove events, You have just seen the real story behind one of the most misunderstood events in history. The Black Death was not a disembodied tragedy that happened to a nameless mass of people. It was a siege of every village, every house, every body. And like any siege, it had walls, it had weapons, it had strategies, and it had survivors. True students of the blade, I ask you this. What would you have done if you had been in that village, in that year, with no antibiotics and no medical knowledge and no hope? Would you have stayed and prayed? Would you have fled to the hills? Would you have locked your door and burned the letters from your neighbors? The answer you give says more about who you are than any quiz or personality test ever could. Drop it in the comments. Your words will survive long after the plague of our own time has faded into the textbooks of the future. Because here is the truth that keeps me up at night. The Black Death did not just happen once. It happens every time a civilization becomes complacent, every time we forget that the walls we build are never high enough, the oaths we swear are never strong enough, and the systems we trust are never permanent. The plague of the 14th century was a wake-up call that Europe nearly slept through. And what rose from the ashes was a world that looked like ours, but only just barely. In the next video, we will walk the walls of a city under siege, from the inside. Not from the plague this time, from the enemy armies that waited outside the gates. And you will see what happens when the social order collapses not from a disease, but from a trebuchet. The connection between the two will surprise you. Until then, keep your walls dry, your grain stores clean, and your oaths to yourself. The world is always one bad harvest away from chaos, and you are one piece of knowledge away from surviving it. And you are one piece of knowledge away from surviving it. The flea that jumped onto that sailor's hand in Kaffa did not just carry a disease. It carried the blueprint for a new world. A world where the old walls of stone and oath and relic meant nothing, and where a peasant could outlive a king by the simple, brutal luck of being born in the wrong hovel. The chroniclers called it God's punishment. The survivors called it a lesson, and the lesson was this. The systems you build to protect yourself are the same systems that will trap you when they fail. Remember that flea from Kaffa. It carried a blueprint. The one that says every wall you trust will one day fail you. Subscribe so the next time a headline screams about collapse, you already know the pattern from the inside. And in the comments, drop the one word that just landed on you. Blueprint, systems, luck. Whichever hit hardest. Because the lesson is only alive if you write it down. So when you next scroll past a headline about a virus, or a famine, or a war, stop. Remember the grain ships of the Black Sea. Remember the mass graves of Siena. Remember the laborer who walked away from his lord's field because his lord could not protect him. The past is not dead. It is not even past. And the only thing thicker than the stone walls of a castle is the thread of luck that separates you from the next flea. You think of the Black Death as a historical event, something that happened to other people in a distant century. But the mechanism of collapse never changes. A system fails when the gap between what it promises and what it delivers becomes too wide to ignore. The feudal system promised protection in exchange for obedience. When the plague came, the protection vanished, but the obedience was still demanded. That gap, that fracture between expectation and reality, is what killed the medieval world more surely than any bacillus ever could. The chronicler John of Reading, writing from Westminster Abbey in the 1360s, recorded a telling detail. A group of peasants from Kent presented a petition to the king, demanding the right to sell their labor to the highest bidder. They did not ask permission to rebel. They asked permission to participate in the economy as free agents. The king refused. The peasants shrugged and did it anyway. The law could not keep up with the reality, and the reality was that a man with a strong back and a working scythe could name his price. The entire legal apparatus of feudalism crumbled under the weight of a simple, undeniable fact. You cannot force a man to work for starvation wages when the alternative is a town full of desperate landlords offering 3 times as much. That is the hidden engine of history. It is not kings, not generals, not popes. It is the quiet, relentless calculation of ordinary people deciding that the old rules no longer apply. The Black Death did not create that calculation. It accelerated it, compressed it, made it visible. And once the calculation was made, it could not be unmade. Every subsequent wave of plague, every labor shortage, every empty village reinforced the same lesson. The oaths you swore were worth what the market would bear. The walls you built were only as strong as the grain inside them. The relics you prayed to were powerless against a flea in the right place at the right time. Here is the final, uncomfortable truth that the textbooks will never teach you. The Black Death was not an anomaly. It was the normal operating procedure of the pre-modern world, revealed in a single, catastrophic event. The fragility of life, the porousness of walls, the emptiness of oaths, the randomness of survival, these were not exceptions. They were the baseline. What we call civilization is a temporary and fragile membrane stretched over the chaos of biology and geography. And every few centuries, the membrane tears. So, when you walk out of your house tomorrow, look at the street. Look at the people in the cars, in the shops, on the sidewalks. Look at the buildings, the power lines, the water pipes, the hospitals. Every one of those things is a wall you did not build. A wall built by people who learned in their bones what happens when the walls fall down. The Black Death did not just kill 50 million people. It built the world you live in, the laws, the wages, the freedoms, the technologies. All of them are shadows cast by that single catastrophic event. And the flea that started it all, it is still out there, waiting, because nature does not negotiate. It does not compromise. It does not give second chances. It only tests the walls again and again until it finds the crack. And when it does, the only thing standing between you and the mass graves of Siena is the thread of luck your ancestors passed down to you in their blood. Use that luck wisely, because the siege never ends. It only changes shape.